Hello everyone, welcome to My Future Africa. Today we'll be answering the question, what is Juneteenth? Juneteenth, also known as Freedom Day, Jubilee Day, Liberation Day or Emancipation Day, is the oldest nationally celebrated commemoration of the ending of slavery in the United States. It dates back to June 19, 1865, when Union soldiers led by Major General Gordon Granger landed at Galveston, Texas, with news that the war had ended and that the enslaved were now free. This was 2.5 years after President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which had become official on January 1st, 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation had little impact on Texans due to the minimal number of Union troops to enforce the new executive order. With the surrender of Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse 2 months earlier in April of 1865 in Virginia, and the arrival of General Granger's regiment, the forces were finally strong enough to influence and overcome the resistance. There are several explanations as to why it took 2.5 years for the important news to be received. One often told story is that the messenger was murdered on his way to Texas with the news. Another is that the news was deliberately withheld by the enslavers to maintain the labor force on the plantation. Yet another explanation is that federal troops actually waited for the slave owners to reap the benefits of one last cotton harvest before going to Texas to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. All of these or none of these versions could be true. For some, President Lincoln's authority over the rebellious states was in question. But whatever the reasons, conditions in Texas remained status quo well beyond what was statutory. On arriving in Texas, General Granger read his first orders of business, the General Order Number 3, which states, and I quote, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of rights and the rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired laborer." The reaction to this profound news ranged from pure shock to immediate jubilation. While many lingered to learn of this new employer-to-employee relationship, many left before these offers were completely off the lips of their former masters, attesting to the varying conditions on the plantations and the realization of freedom. Even with nowhere to go, many felt that leaving the plantation would be their first grasp of freedom. North was a logical destination, and for many, it represented true freedom, while the desire to reach family members in neighboring states drove some into Louisiana, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. Settling into these new areas as free men and women brought on new realities and the challenges of establishing a heretofore non-existent status for black people in America. Recounting the memories of that great day in June of 1865 and its festivities would serve a motivation as well as a release from the growing pressures encountered in their new territories. The celebration of June 19th was coined Juneteenth and grew with more participation from descendants. The Juneteenth celebration was a time for reassuring each other, for praying and for gathering remaining family members. Juneteenth continued to be highly revered in Texas decades later, with many former slaves and descendants making an annual pilgrimage back to Galveston on this day. Although Juneteenth generally celebrates the end of slavery in the United States, it was still legal and practiced in two Union border states, Delaware and Kentucky, until later that year when ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolished chattel slavery nationwide in December. When it comes to Juneteenth festivities, a range of activities were provided to entertain the masses, many of which continue to be tradition today. Rodeos, fishing, barbecuing, and baseball are just a few of the typical Juneteenth activities you may witness today. Juneteenth almost always focused on education and self-improvement. Thus, often guest speakers are brought in and the elders are called upon to recount the events of the past. Prayer service was also a major part of this celebration. Certain foods became popular and subsequently synonymous with Juneteenth celebrations, such as strawberry soda pop. Food was abundant because everyone prepared a special dish. Meat such as lamb, pork, and beef, which were not available every day, were brought on this special occasion. A true Juneteenth celebration left visitors well satisfied and with enough conversation to last until the next. Dress was also an important element in the early Juneteenth customs and is often still taken seriously, particularly by the direct descendants who can make the connection to these traditional roots. During slavery, there were laws on the books in many areas that prohibited or limited the dressing of the enslaved. During the initial days of the emancipation celebration, there are accounts of former slaves tossing their ragged garments into the creeks and rivers and adorning themselves with clothing taken from the plantations belonging to their former masters. Traditions include public reading of the Emancipation Proclamation, singing traditional songs such as Swing Low, Sweet Chariots, and Lift Every Voice and Sing, and reading of works by noted African American writers such as Ralph Ellison and Maya Angelou. Looking at Juneteenth and the society, in the early years, little interest existed outside the African American community in participation in this celebration. In some cases, there was outwardly exhibited resistance by barring the use of public property for festivities because of the state-sponsored segregation of facilities. Most of the festivities found themselves out in rural areas around rivers and creeks that would provide for additional activities such as fishing, horseback riding, and barbecues. Often church grounds were the site for such activities. Eventually, as African Americans became landowners, land was donated and dedicated for these festivities. One of the earliest documented land purchase in the name of Juneteenth was organized by Reverend Jack Yates. This fundraising effort yielded $1,000 and made possible the purchase of Emancipation Park in Houston, Texas. In Mexia, the local Juneteenth organization purchased Booker T. Washington Park, which had become the Juneteenth celebration site in 1898. There are accounts of Juneteenth activities being interrupted and halted by white landowners, demanding that their laborers return to work. However, it seemed most allowed their workers that day off, and some even made donations to food and money. For decades, these annual celebrations flourished, growing continuously with each passing year. In Booker T. Washington Park, as many as 20,000 African Americans once attended during the course of a week, making the celebration one of the state's largest. Looking at the decline in Juneteenth celebration, economic and cultural forces led to a decline in Juneteenth activities and participants beginning in early 1900s. Classroom and textbook education, in lieu of traditional home and family thought practices, stifled the interest in youth due to less emphasis and detail on the lives of former slaves. Classroom textbook proclaimed Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863 as the date signaling the end of slavery and mentioned little or nothing of the impact of General Granger's arrival on June 19th. The Depression forced many people off the farms and into the cities to find work. In this urban environment, employers were less eager to grant leave to celebrate this date. Thus, unless June 19th fell on weekend or holiday, there were very few participants available. July 4th was already the established independence holiday, and a rise in patriotism steered more towards this celebration. The civil rights movement of 1950s and 1960s yielded both positive and negative results for Juneteenth celebrations. While it pulled many of the African American youths away and into the struggle for racial equality, many linked the struggle to the historical struggles of their ancestors. This was evidenced by student demonstrators involved in Atlanta's civil rights campaign in early 1960s who wore Juneteenth freedom buttons. Again in 1968, Juneteenth received another strong resurgence through the Poor People's March to Washington, D.C. Reverend Ralph Abernathy's call for people of all races, creeds, and economic levels and professions to come to Washington to show support for the poor. Many of these attendees returned home and initiated Juneteenth celebration in areas previously absent of such activities. In fact, two of the largest Juneteenth celebrations founded after this march are now held in Milwaukee and Minneapolis. Now let's look at Texas' recognition of Juneteenth. On January 1st, 1980, Juneteenth became an official state holiday through the effort of A.I. Edwards, an African American state legislator. The successful passage of this bill marked Juneteenth as the first emancipation celebration granted official state recognition. Edwards has since actively sought to spread the observance of Juneteenth across all America. Today, Juneteenth is enjoying phenomenal growth rate within communities and organizations throughout the country. Institutions such as the Smithsonian and the Henry Ford Museum and others have begun sponsoring Juneteenth-centered activities. In recent years, a number of local and national Juneteenth organizations have risen to take their place alongside older organizations, all with mission to promote and cultivate knowledge and appreciation of African American history and culture. Juneteenth today celebrates African American freedom and achievement, while encouraging continuous self-improvement and respect for all cultures. As it takes on a more national, symbolic, and even global perspective, the event of 1865 in Texas are not forgotten, for all of the roots tie back to the fertile soil from which a national day of pride is growing. Today, Hawaii, North Dakota, and South Dakota are the only states that do not recognize Juneteenth, according to the Congressional Research Service. Activists, including the United States Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, are campaigning for the United States Congress to recognize Juneteenth as a national holiday. If you have learned something from this video, we encourage you to subscribe to us on YouTube, on Facebook, and on Twitter. And we look forward to seeing you in our next video. Bye.